Welcome to the second part of Azure Governance and Compliance. In this part, we'll look at Azure policy initiatives and talk about role-based access control. So let's get started. In Azure policies, we can look at managing different resources. Now, why do we need policies? There could be a requirement that you might want to control certain part of your subscriptions and limit different things from happening. Could be cost related, could be different compliance and standards that you might want to comply with. You don't want certain teams creating resources in certain region. You don't want certain people creating certain type of resources, maybe because it costs too much, maybe because they don't have a need for it. So you might want to limit certain things in your environment based on your setup. Now you can easily achieve some of this by creating Azure policies. Now, Azure policies can be created by simply looking at a definition of a policy. So you define what the policy is going to be and implementing it into a scope that you define. Now, there can be loads of different types of policies available to you. By default, in Azure Portal, there are quite a few different policies that we can pick from. We'll have a quick look at them just in a minute. There are some examples listed on the screen that we can pick from. For example, we might want to limit a certain types of allowed resources in our environment. So your organization can only pick from the list of things that they are given options to work with. You might want to go and even specify a particular type of SKU that's available or stock keeping unit that's available for users to work with in a particular resource type. In this case, virtual machines. Or we can restrict them to work within a region. So I don't want them to create resources that's out of my compliance area. Might be something that's too far away from my users or end users, or might cost me too much if I was to place them in different regions. So I can look at region restrictions. Also, I can, for management part, add different things. For instance, add a tag to resources. So later on, when I'm managing these resources, I can filter them through either within my builds or my reports. Or I can also look at creating things like enable a particular feature. So if you're creating a machine, a virtual machine in my environment, it should have a backup for security or for compliance purposes. Now, for me to implement Azure policies, three things that we need to consider. One, a definition of something that we are going to apply as part of my setup. I can either pick one from the list of definitions that are already available, or I can choose to create my own, depending on what suits my needs. Then I'll choose a scope. Where can I apply this policy? Earlier on in the first part of this session, we spoke about different architectural components, and we mentioned things like management groups. We looked at subscriptions, and we spoke about resource groups. And the fourth layer that's missing from the list is resources. Now, your Azure policies can only be applied at management groups, subscription, or resource groups. You can't filter them down onto a particular resource. Finally, once you have your policy defined and applied a particular scope, you can then look at your compliance reports to understand how well your policy is doing. Now, there are a few things to understand. If I'm working with my policies and applying them, as a result, as my assessment compliance report, I might see certain resources that are not compliant to my policy based on the scope that I apply. For instance, I apply a policy to entire subscription and I want to see results of how many resources within that subscription comply to that policy. Now, if for any reason I have, let's say, a few resources that don't comply, I'll simply get a non-compliance report over here under my compliance area. Now, this non-compliance report does not stop me from working with those resources. However, it just simply tells me there are resources in my environment that are non-compliant to my initial definition of this policy. Now, after the policy comes into effect, which typically takes 5 to 15 minutes, no one would be able to create a new resource within the outside of the scope of the policy or the definition of the policy. However, any existing resources might report back into compliance report as compliant or non-compliant. So the non-compliant resources, like I mentioned, don't get impacted as much as such. For example, they're not going to be stopped, they're not going to be deleted, and nothing will happen to them apart from just notifying you that there are resources that are non-compliant. You can take action against them. There are certain areas where we can add remediation tasks to it to add some things that are missing. Things that, if they don't exist, can be added. For instance, if my policy that I'm creating is to say, hey, go and add tags, and I want this tag to be added onto all the resources, and I can define a tag value and a key and a value. Or I can simply say, inherit a tag from a resource group, or something similar. In that case, I'll choose where I'm defining this resource type. And finally, when I get my non-compliance report, I'll see resources that were missing the tag. But if I've defined already a remediation task along with it, then in that case, it can report back resources were non-compliant and where the resources were added and tagged. Along with that, if I'm creating multiple policies in my environment, instead of applying, let's say, 20, 50, 500 policies to my management group, I could simply look at a better way of doing that. Remember, we're always trying to do things that are least admin effort. Now, in this case, we can achieve the same by simply creating an initiative in my environment. Now, creating an initiative simply allows me to group all the policies in one place and then push out the policy initiative to my management group, which will simply save me from applying those policies again and again. Now, if I wanted to reapply the same initiative to another management group, maybe with some tweaks, I can do that. I can push out that initiative again. So it saves me time of applying, like I said, any number of policies that I might have. As an example, 500. Let's have a quick look at this. All right, we're back in the portal. Now, within the portal, one thing I'm going to do is type in policy. And you can see I have my policies available for me to look at. So let's click on them. Let's hide the menu blade to make more space. And this is a quick overview of my current setup that I have in terms of my policies. Now, my current demo environment doesn't necessarily look very healthy. I have loads of resources that are non-compliant and only a few that are compliant. Again, it's a demo environment, but that doesn't mean I should keep them non-compliant. I should really look into them. Right, one thing I want to do is go into my definitions. This is where I have a long list of predefined policies that I have available in the portal that I can pick from, and I can apply them. Or I can simply go and create a new policy if I don't find one for my requirements. And I can apply that in my environments. So let's pick one from the list. Let's try filtering down with tags, as we mentioned tags earlier on. So if I click on tags and see some details coming through, I can see there are quite a few different policies that are now popping up that we can pick from. So let's filter through some of them. Inherit a tag from a resource group. And then it carries on talking about some more details. Let's have a look at some others. Add or replace a tag on a resource group. Inherit a tag from a resource group. Again, that's good to see. Again, quite a few different options. Inherit a tag from subscription. So I have a few different options to look at in this case from my setup. Now, apart from tags, let's try one more. Let's try location. So if I want to limit locations in my resources, I can see some more policies that are listed around locations. So allowed locations for a resource group. So if I created this policy, then users working within this subscription will only be limited to creating a resource group in a particular location. Let's go through with one of these examples. Let's pick up on allowed locations. All right, now once we get into the policy definition, you can see what this policy is for. Again, this is allowed locations. It's a built-in policy that we have. And there are some other parameters that we can see in a JSON format in this document. Now, let's go ahead and start assigning this policy. As part of the assignment, one thing that we need to choose is the scope of where we are assigning this policy. Currently, it's pre-populated, thinking I'm assigning this to my subscription. However, we can change the scope. As mentioned before, we can choose this to apply it to a root management group or any other sub-management groups that we have within that. And we can also choose to apply it onto a particular subscription. However, if you're looking to apply for more than one subscription, it's probably better to apply it on a management group. So create a management group that has those subscriptions available within. Apart from that, I can narrow this down further to a resource group. For example, we can go and choose the AZ104 demo group, resource group that we created earlier for our resource group demo. Now, let's go ahead and select this. Once we've selected our scope, the next thing we can look at is some more details further down in here. This particular policy definition is allowed location, as we saw on the previous screen. And further down, if you look at the name that we've got for the policy, is by default allowed location. You can change that if you prefer. Add some description on why you're creating this policy, what's the reason behind it, the regions that you have, who's working with this policy, or whatever information that you want to provide with other people that are collaborating with you on the subscription. Now, let's go to the next tab, which is parameters. Now, in the parameters tabs, this is where we are going to complete some more details around the definition of the policy, particularly for us, allowed locations. So what locations are actually allowed for the scope that we've chosen? In this case, let's go ahead and choose UK South. Now, let's move on from here to the next tab, which is called remediation. Now, remediation tasks can be assigned as part of the policy. If the policy is found resources that are non-compliant, it can simply go into triggering some of the remediation tasks for you. However, it's important to understand that these tasks might not be able to perform every single task that's out there. For instance, if I'm missing a tag on a resource, it can simply inherit a tag or add a value for a tag for me if that wasn't existent. So looking at deploy if.exist. However, we are creating a location-based policy at the moment. It's not going to look at an existing resource that is within my scope and out of the parameters that we've defined. So a resource that's in a different region, and start moving it into the region of the policy that I'm creating. So it won't be able to carry that task out. Now, part of the tasks or remediation tasks, it requires you to assign a managed identity so it can carry out those tasks on your behalf. So it would need you to allocate it an identity. Again, we'll look into managed identities a bit more detail later in the course. Now, the next part that we have on the tab is non-compliance message. This is the message that goes out to the users when they start creating a resource after this policy comes into effect in terms of what they're doing wrong, to restrict them from doing certain actions. Now, this could be a message suggesting on how they can perform this better, what regions are allocated, what are allowed, or whatever message that you might want to add. Let's add a message here. And we'll say you are creating resources in the wrong region again. That's the message I want to send out. Now let's hit create and review, and finally we'll hit create to see this policy created. Now, typically, if you look at the details on the policy creation, the policy is currently successfully accepted and created. However, for it to completely be effective, it might take 5 to 15 minutes. Now that simply tells me if I look into the compliance report of this policy, it might not show me all the details immediately. So let's have a quick look at that. If I go back into my policies, and this time we are stepping away from definitions to assignments. Now in assignments, we're simply looking for the policy that we just created called allowed locations. And that's the policy here. If I go into it, I can see what this policy is all around. So looking at the parameters of the policy, allowed locations UK South, and on the top over here I have view compliance. If I click on the compliance report for this policy, I should be able to see currently what's the status of this policy. This policy, particularly right now, is not started. Like I said, it can take from 5 to 15 minutes. Once it does, it will then list out all the resources that are non-compliant and give me the reasons of why they're not non-compliant. Then I can go into remediating some of them if they don't already had a remediation task, or if they can't be resolved by remediation tasks. However, if this policy is effective, I should see a report on how many resources I have that are compliant and non-compliant, as we saw earlier in my overall policies. Now, let's take a step back out of all of that and have a quick look at how the non-compliance look like if I go into my compliance part over here to understand my current compliant current compliance to my entire policy. As I mentioned before, I have about 64 non-compliance messages. So let's have a quick look at all of them. So if I go down to the list over here, let's pick up any one of them and have a look at this. So it's a non-compliance report. I can click on that. I can understand a little bit more around what the non-compliance part is and go and dig deeper into a particular resource that is non-compliant and follow the policy that is implemented and suggesting that this resource is non-compliant, and then find remediation tasks for it or resolve this manually. Now, once this policy is in effect, let's try some things out. Very quickly, I'm just going to jump into a random resource. We'll talk about some of these resources a bit later in the course. Let's go and create a random resource. And I am choosing a resource that's going into the demo 104 group that we have. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is change the region to West US 3 and try creating this resource. But before I go any further, you can see straight away I get an error message telling me you are creating the resources in the wrong region again. The message that we created earlier. And in this case, we are going to be pointed at the policy that's giving me that message. If I need to read more into it, I can click on the policy details here. It takes me back onto the allowed location policy that we created, and it will stop me from doing that. Or again, I can read into more around the policy to understand that better. Now this brings us to the end of policies. Let's start moving on to a new topic. Let's move into securing your resources by implementing role-based access control, in short, RBAC. Now let's jump onto a whiteboard to understand some of the details behind that. Right, let's make some space on the whiteboard so we can start configuring some details. I'll bring back into the core components of Azure as we can have a conversation around this. So let's zoom into some of the details that we need to know around this. Now, before we go into RBAC, let's have a quick conversation about something we discussed very briefly in module number 1, talking about Entra. Now, as we covered Entra ID, we spoke about how part of my Entra ID, I get different roles allocated to my users. Particularly, our hero admin, Alice, got assigned global admin as being the main person in charge of creating the tenant and managing the tenant for us. So Alice became global admin. Along with that, we mentioned that we could look at resources where we can have or roles where we can have administrators grouped up into a group managing our applications. So we could look at a role assigned to them, which we mentioned in the first module as application administrator. So let's have a quick look at that, writing that application administrator. Now, there are long list of roles that are available for us to look at in our Entra environment. However, this is just to kind of differentiate that we are not looking at currently talking about my Entra environment, and we have moved on to the world of Azure. So in this part of the session, we are going to very briefly understand how things look different when we talk about Azure and not talk about the roles that exist for us in Entra. So in this part, we're going to look at discussing the world of Azure. And within Azure, we are now discussing role-based access control. Now, role-based access control, for us to understand this, first of all, we need to understand in the portal, typically we'll see role-based access control also mentioned as access control. At some point on the portal, you'll see written as IAM or Identity and Access Management. Again, different names for the same thing and how you access them in the portal environment. Typically, you'll see IAM available for you to implement at multiple levels. So you can look at implementing IAM at your management group level. You can look at implementing IAM at your subscriptions level. You can look at IAM implemented at your resource group, or finally on an individual resources as well, or resource. Now, what does this allow me to do? Let's have a quick understanding of this. For instance, if I am going to go and create a resource, as an example, I'm going to use a virtual machine in this case. I go and create a virtual machine. Now, me as a user, I'll call myself user 1. I created this resource group in my environment. Now, as we already understand from the core architecture for my resources, typically this resource must be placed in a resource group. And this is where I'm trying to create a resource group. Now, once I place this in the resource group, this resource group must belong to a subscription as a structure that we spoke about earlier on. So I'll have to again understand that this will belong to a subscription. Now let's stop here for a minute before we go any further, that the subscription could also belong to a management group, but let's stop here for a minute. Now, as I create this resource in my environments, typically what will happen is I get allocated different roles. These roles, like mentioned earlier, are looking at role-based access control or identity and access management under Azure. This will be giving me the highest level of access that we have, referred as the owner role in this environment. I am the owner of this resource. Now, no matter what my setup looks like in the intro side of the world, does not impact me in this environment on what I'm doing. Given that I have access to my subscription and no limitations of creating resources, I created a resource. I typically become the owner of that resource, giving me highest level of access on that resource that I'm creating. Now, after creating that resource, I might want to start collaborating with others onto this resource environment. Now, I might want to invite you and maybe a couple of other users to come and collaborate with me on this. And we are working on this project together. Now, let's add, let's say user 2, user 3, and user 4 in this environment. Now, if I'm bringing you into this environment to come and collaborate with me on this virtual machine, the single instance that we've got created, let's call this VM1. Now, typically, I don't want to assign you the owner role in this environment. This is, again, something that we speak about under Zero Trust as one of the methodologies that we look at implementing security in our environment. Now, Zero Trust has quite a few different pillars and principles. Now, part of Zero Trust, you need to understand that we have one of the areas that suggests we should apply least privileged access to resources in our environments, which means let's limit what level of access I give to people at all times. Do they need just enough access to be able to work their task? And can I control that by just-in-time access for that resource? So I want to limit some of that. I don't want someone to have access to a resource for the sake of it. We'll give them access when they need it, and we'll give them enough access so they can carry out the tasks that they need to perform. So now if I'm asking you to come and collaborate with me on this resource, I don't necessarily need you to be the owner of that resource. I simply want you to be able to configure things into it, modify things into it maybe, or even limit you just for you to be able to read that resource. So the next role I could give you, if you're collaborating with me on this, is a contributor role. Now, the contributor has pretty much all level of access to work in my environment on a resource. However, if I write here minus, taking away that they don't have control, let's try that again. So let's type in permissions. So they don't have access to permissions. So typically they can't change their permissions, so they can't elevate themselves. Let's minus that out here. So taking away permissions from this. So they can't give access to permissions. They can't change their permissions. They can't elevate their own permissions. Can't change someone else's permission. So this is where sometimes you can allocate users with different level of access. And I also mentioned there's one more role that we can look at, and that is a reader. Now, reader would simply mean someone can just read the resource. They can't start it, stop it, change it, modify it, or delete it. In this case, a contributor can do all of those tasks. The only thing the contributor can't do is change permissions. Something to bear in mind. Now, there are a long list of resource Azure roles available for us to implement, apart from just these three. But these are the most common general roles that we get to see in RBAC, in role-based access control, applied to a resource. Now, very quickly, I just want to explain a scenario where we can talk about a little bit more in detail on how these roles can change and how we can implement some changes using a very special role we have in our environment. Let's assume I have gone on a leave for about a few weeks. Let's say this is 3-4 weeks, a lovely holiday, somewhere going nice, and I'm not working. In the meantime, your users need a new project manager, and your company goes and gets a new project manager that is going to be managing these resources and guiding these users U2, U3, U4 to work with this project. However, this new user that we've got in our environment does not have any access to this resource or the resource group or the subscription that we're working on. Someone needs to give access to this resource that we have in this environment. Now, the current users that have access, they only have access at a contributor level, and they can't change permissions. That means they can't assign this new user permission. We have a situation where we cannot go into these settings and or in the RBAC and change these settings. Now, this is where some changes can happen or we can bring in the conversation a little bit understanding of Entra. Now, in most part of my RBAC that we are covering, role-based access control, like I said earlier on, this is complete different world. We are not bringing in Entra in the conversations for pretty much most of the time. Now, as part of my tenant settings in Entra, we covered in module 1. Along with this, there is a setting that has a small checkbox that suggests, can I control all the resources that are part of the tenant, which also includes my subscriptions that are part of the tenant. So subscriptions are typically tied down to a tenant. If your global administrator ticks that box, typically the global administrator then has access to the subscription that you have in your environment. Now, that's pretty much it by ticking that box in Entra. That's all they can do in terms of settings. However, when they do that, by default, when they're looking at their Entra setup in here, they don't necessarily gain access to the resource by just making that change. What they would need to do is assign themselves another role. This is where we can talk about user access, if I can talk and type, user access admin role or administrator role. Now, user access administrator role has quite a few privileges. Things like it can see all the resources, so you can see all in that area where you've applied this to, particularly in this scenario, let's say the subscription. They can also go and change permissions to anything that's within that environment. Now, they do have one more area where they can create support tickets, but this session, we're not really looking into support tickets, but we're concerned with permissions. Now, they can look into changing permissions. Now, based on you as a global admin, or in our scenario, Ellis, the admin, from our Entra setup, can go into the subscription and assign themselves a user access admin role. And based on that role, they can go back into the new project manager and give them a role, maybe an owner role if that's what they require, so they can go and manage that resource in that environment. So this is where we can look into different types of roles. I'll demonstrate some of this in the portal in just a short while. Before we move away, one last thing to understand here is this. If I'm looking to assign roles to resources, let's assume in my setup, I don't have one virtual machine. I have a few. Let's call this VM2. Let's create another one. Let's assume this is VM3. And I'll keep on creating a few more. And let's assume we have a few in this environment. Now, if I want to assign you access to this resource, now in the start I mentioned assigning your contributor role to a single resource. Now I want to assign you access to VM2, we have VM3 here, VM4 and VM5. And instead of giving you access to all of these machines one by one, again, we want to look for the least admin effort to achieve the same task that we need to do. What I can do is widen my scope and give you access to the entire resource group and assign you permission on the resource group so you can manage everything inside of that resource group. Now, for this particular example, it suits me very well. There's no other issue for me because there are simply some virtual machines that I'm working with in this environment. And if I was to assign that, it should work very, very nicely in that environment and it should not cause me any issues. However, let's assume instead of having some virtual machines, I have some other resources in this as well. I have a database, or maybe a few databases, or I have an app service that's running in this environment, or maybe some sort of a resource like a firewall or apps or something else. Now I have multiple types of resources in here. If I was to give you a contributor role at the resource group level, the only issue I get to see over here is that you would gain access to all the resources that I have in here apart from the ones I want you to work with me on. Now, this is where we can start exploring other resource or RBAC roles that are available for us. For this particular scenario, I'll particularly look at a virtual machine contributor role rather than giving you a contributor role or a general contributor role. Why? Because the general contributor role allows you to contribute on everything that's underneath it. As a virtual machine contributor role, if I was to give you this and assign that to the entire resource group, simply will limit you in changing or working with just the virtual machines and no other resource that lives within that. So in this scenario, I'm widening the scope but narrowing down on the permissions that I'm allowing you to work on. Similarly, if I had multiple of the resource groups and I had loads of different resources running, but you only manage virtual machines for me in an entire subscription, and this time I need to give you permission not on a resource group but onto an entire subscription, and I want you to collaborate with me on all the virtual machines instead of giving you a contributor role on the entire subscription, I might simply narrow down your access to a virtual machine contributor. Now let's have a quick look at this in the portal. Now I'm back onto the portal. One of the few things that we want to try doing is looking at management groups to begin with. And like I said, if I go into any part of my management groups, I can see my IAM listed over here. This is my identity and access management or access control or role-based access control. I can take a step back out of this. I can go into, let's go into a resource first. We'll jump back into resource groups in a minute. And I can see in an individual resource, again, this is a virtual machine as a resource. So I can see my access management at a resource level. If I take a step back up, go into resource groups, the resource group that we just created. And if I go and see, I have identity and access management here. If I take a step back further up and go into my subscriptions that we are looking at today, so let's go into my subscription and I can see my identity and access management at all levels. So I can have that control added at any point. Now let's go into it and have a look at what details can we find in here. Now, as we move into this, some nice messages looking at some expiring classic resources. Let's move along from them and let's have a look at this. As we go into access management in my subscription, looking at IAM, I can see current roles. I can see current roles that are active. But if I click on the list of roles that I have available under here, these are some predefined or built-in roles that I have. Now, we spoke about these general roles like the owner, contributor, and the reader role. Like I mentioned, these are general roles. Now, before I show you some of these roles, let's have a quick look at the long list of roles that we have available within this environment. So again, we're not going to be necessarily covering every single one of these because it will take us forever. However, by all means, there are documentation available for you to go through, looking at 680 different results that I have on my portal at this point to explore through some of these roles. Now, just to understand some of these roles, we could actually click on any one of these roles to see what that actually means and how does it work. One of the ways for me to explain this could be clicking on viewing the permissions that we have assigned to someone if they were assigned this role. By default, like I said, if you create a resource, you become an owner. However, you can still assign an owner role to someone if there was a need. Particularly, you would give them something less with less access assigned to it. Now, again, if I was to try and explain to you the permissions, there's a long list of these to go through. We have a better way of doing this. Now, I'm going to click on JSON file format over here to look at the documentation for the JSON. This is how it's defined. Now, if you're very new to JSON and you don't think you'll understand, let me tell you otherwise. Let's have a look at the JSON documentation. Now, it's very readable if you look at some of the information that's here. Now, the first part of this particular detail over here tells me a particular unique ID that is assigned to this role. So this role can be uniquely identified in my environment. The second part gives the role name. And the third part is a description to describe what this role is particularly for. Now, the next part that we're looking at is assignable scope, telling me that this is assigned at the root. Now, the important part that we want to discuss today is something that we will highlight in blue. And let's talk about permissions. That's the area that we want to cover today. Now, within my permissions, again, I am not covering data action and not data actions for today, simply because we're not working with data at this point in time. So I'll leave them out just for now. Now, apart from that, the area that we are concerned with today is actions and not actions. Actions are things that you can do, not actions, things you can't do. So you're restricted. This particular role is an owner role. So it has this asterisk in the permissions that they can perform. Typically, this is taken from all or some point a wildcard, or you can look at any. Now, in this case, we can say all. So we can look at all the permissions. You can do everything. Am I stopped from doing something? No, there's nothing defined here to say you can't do certain things. So if you have the owner role at any level, at a resource, you can do everything. At a resource group, you can do everything inside. At a subscription, you can do everything inside that subscription. So it becomes the most powerful role for you to have on a resource. Now, let's compare this to the other couple of roles. So let's go into the contributor role. Again, very quickly, jumping onto the JSON format to look and understand some of this. Now, the top part, like I said, is pretty much readable. And you can break this down to understand exactly what's going on with the mat. The area that we are concerned with is the permissions area. So let's bring the permissions into the full view and start talking about permissions. Now, again, within permissions, we're looking at actions, and actions suggests, oh, the contributor can do everything. However, if I look at some limitations on this, which is not actions, things they can't perform, you can see there are quite a few different areas that they are concerned around authorization, so they can't change, delete, write, elevate their permissions, and some of their similar permission-based settings that they can't change. And again, a few things that they are limited with. And some of those are based on permissions, as I mentioned before. So can't change permissions, yet again, they can do everything just like the contributor can do. They can change everything. Now, if I compare this very quickly to the reader role and have a look at the reader settings and go into the JSON to check the permissions out, now the reader is very nicely described. If I look at the permissions in here, first of all, the reader's action is to do all as long as it's limited to read. However, they are not restricted from or being stopped from doing certain tasks. There's no limitation on that. As long as their actions are read, they can perform anything. So if you're giving someone a reader task, they can just read. So this is nice to look at. Now, one last role that we did speak about was user access admin. Now, if I jump onto the user access administrator role, and I'm sure it's just down there. There it is. Now let's have a quick look at how this role looks like. And if I go back into the JSON of this role, I can see the few things that I pointed out earlier. As an action, they can see, they can change all permissions. They can read everything that's inside of this. Again, if you were assigning this to someone as a subscription, or typically your global administrator assigning them to themselves, gaining access to a subscription, they can see all of it, they can change everything, and like I mentioned, they can also look at doing some support stuff as well, which we are not discussing in this course. However, nothing to or no permissions stopping them from any particular actions. Now, one thing that is interesting to see, I mentioned earlier on virtual machine contributor role, simply because I said, hey, instead of giving them a role into a wider scope that gives them more than the permission that they require, we can limit this. Now, again, like I said earlier on, these are general roles that we were discussing. Further down, if you look at it, you can see other resources or roles that are defined for particular services. So we can filter this down by category, or I can simply go in here and say, show me compute-based roles. And I can see some virtual machine-based roles coming up in here as well. So you can see virtual machine contributor role. This is something that I'll probably assign to someone if they're just managing virtual machines in my environment, rather than everything in a particular resource or under a subscription. So good to know about some of these roles. Now, one last thing before we conclude. Like I mentioned, there's a long list of roles available for us to look at. However, if you are interested to create new roles, you can do this. All you need to do is simply click on the add roles and go into creating a new role in here. And this is probably where it will start taking you through and defining what type of permissions that you need, that you can't find in this long list of things, and you can go and start defining them. By all means, you can create a new role name, you can define different settings around that role, permissions, and again, get to create that role in your environment. Now, I'll leave the creation of the role out for now, but again, something that you can explore in terms of creating a role in your environment when you're managing these resources in your environment. It's good to see that you can create roles if there was a need for you to pick a role that's not already on the list. As we conclude this module on Administer governance and compliance, let's recap the key points covered. We have described the core architectural components of Azure and how to control and organize Azure resources using Azure Resource Manager. We also explored configuring Azure policy, including implementing access management for Azure resources. Finally, we discussed securing Azure resources with role-based access control, RBAC, and looked at creating custom roles if needed. Remember to review the reference modules and check your knowledge questions on Microsoft Learn using aka.ms/learn to reinforce your learning. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.